Is this being recorded? Are we recording?
Yes.
Okay, great. How often do you think about the Roman Empire?
Absolutely never.
Ever?
Ever.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What about what?
I told my wife, I was like, the problem with this question is, as someone who preaches,
You're like, I think
the
about
New
it
Testament
all
is
the time.
just saturated in the Roman Empire. So I think about it at least 3 times a month.
Yes, but that's because you
Because
read your
Rory
Bible
reads
at
his
least
Bible 3 times a month. That's what we're hearing.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I feel like it's like, I don't think about the premise of like, how long did it take them to like collapse?
You're not thinking about Caesar Augustus.
Why,
right?
right
Well,
now?
he is.
When I read the Bible, I'm thinking and meditating on the Lord.
Okay, so Rory's not doing that.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Preaching Lab podcast. We are so glad that you joined us. This episode is like our third take at this point. We're having too much fun, but we're so glad that you've joined us. I am joined here with 2 special guests, 2 people that are just having so much fun today. One of those guests is Aaron Olson. Aaron is the executive pastor of all sorts of things at New Life Church.
Yes.
What do you oversee? Just to help the
Creative
people?
communication and production.
Executive pastor of creative communications and productions.
Yes, sir.
Is that the whole title? Does that fit
That's
on a business
the title.
card? That's what you do.
But we do more, obviously.
Okay,
but
great.
That's the title.
So Aaron Olson, and then my dear friend Laura Collins, who is the creative director and oversees social media and communications and everything in the world.
Well, let's call it communications, creative, video, worship production, weekend content.
All the stuff.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
she is from Compass Christian Church
Yes.
in Dallas, Fort Worth. Guys, I'm so glad to have you
Thanks
on
for
this
having us.
episode. It's gonna be great. I don't know where it's gonna go.
You
but
have
it's gonna
no
be great.
regrets about having us already.
I have no regrets.
Thanks for the
This is our
opportunity, Rory.
4th take or so. Part of the reason that I brought you 2 on is twofold. One, Aaron, you just gave a really brilliant talk at our Essential Church Learning Community.
You weren't there for it.
But I know it was coming. I saw the content. But you talked all about media, how the church can engage with it in a helpful way.
Yes.
So that's one. You have some fresh content that's percolating on your mind about this. But 2, I think it's interesting because so much of the church right now, I think is experiencing preaching not just on a Sunday morning. They're experiencing these 60-second sermon clips that are determining not just how people are experiencing the gospel, but it's also experiencing what they think about preaching and how it's unfolding. Which means that any of you who are watching and are listening who are preachers, the conversation about how to engage with media, how to engage with social media outside of the church, but then also the creative side of it inside of the church is a pretty important conversation. So what we often do with guests on here when we have people who are like preaching every weekend is we ask them these first 5 questions to sort of get them going to try to get a framework about who they are as preachers. But you guys both have preaching experience, but you sit primarily in roles where you watch people preach, you're watching the service unfold, something that you've helped create and direct. So I actually have 5 questions for you that are a little bit different, but I think it's going to help us sort of get into this space. So the first question I'm curious about for you guys as you think about preaching, what is like the one sermon that you've heard in your life that was the most meaningful? Like it's the one that you can still remember where you were sitting.
Yeah.
What was it? What happened?
For me, it was here at New Life, sitting on the second row, like I always do. And Daniel Groth was preaching on the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. And I remember sitting there and just feeling a true conviction from the Lord because those bridesmaids, they were being so intentional going to the space to prepare the bride. And I remember sitting there and the Holy Spirit just said, Aaron, you're intentional in every aspect of your life except for with your wife and your kids. And so, I mean, I was
I'm
in
sure
that season.
Felt great to hear.
It was beautiful. Because I'm an achiever by nature, and so I dedicate so much to work that when I get home, I can usually be a little bit too tired. And so, man, that's something that I still even remember to this day of when I feel like I'm being a really poor dad or a really crappy husband. I'm like, can't do that.
10 bridesmaids.
10 bridesmaids.
That's so interesting. I think what's interesting about it, Aaron, is what you're pointing out is that what stuck with you in a sermon was not necessarily the content.
Correct.
It was that somebody made space where you were able to be like, oh, God is talking to me.
Yeah.
And telling me something very specific.
Daniel wasn't trying to be an entertaining, communicator. He wasn't trying to overemphasize anything. He just let the scriptures breathe. And I think a lot of times, as I've observed a lot of preachers, they're trying to just cram so much in 35, 45 minutes that the scriptures take the back seat because their analogies taking the front seat, their illustrations taking the front seat, and they don't leave room for the scriptures to breathe and to permeate the soul. And Daniel does a really great job of that. And that was a Sunday where I was just floored.
Shout out to Daniel Grothy.
Shout out.
Love you.
Yeah.
Laura, what about you? Do you have a sermon as you think across the scope of your life or your church experience even that you're like, this sermon has just stuck with me?
Well, there's two moments that come to mind. One, I remember the first time I laughed in a sermon. And that was, I know it's true. Well, as a kid, the church I was going to, you just didn't laugh in sermons.
Oh, interesting.
So when Drew, who became the lead pastor of Compass, came, I remember his first sermon, he told a story that was hilarious and everyone was laughing. And I was like, are we laughing in church?
You can laugh in church.
We can do this. Like, okay, cool. So I remember that moment very clearly. And then I also just remember seeing a woman preach for the first time. And this was just through YouTube, where it was very much in my cadence and slow, and it wasn't loud, it wasn't yelly. It was just like, hey, here's the scripture and here's the Holy Spirit and here's how I'm combining the two. And I was like, oh, women can preach. That's amazing.
Yeah, I was going to ask, up to that point, was the idea of a woman preaching completely foreign to you?
Yes, completely.
Wow.
Yeah, didn't know it was possible. And if it did happen, to me, from what I was experiencing, it all looked the same. Like really loud, really energetic, really like vibrant, over the top. And I was like, one, preaching wasn't on my radar at the time. But two, even if I tried, I'm not going to look like that. And so to see someone who was completely authentically herself, just preaching the gospel as she naturally is, was like, oh, that's a nice little change of pace. Yeah.
So you guys, a second question for you guys. You both spend a ton of time in the creative space. I think preachers are always striving for some level of creativity. What is the most creative thing you have ever seen a pastor or preacher do in a sermon?
So I'm going to actually say something that I did because
Good.
So I preached a sermon. I don't even remember the scripture, but I had a lazy boy recliner brought on stage and a wheelbarrow brought on stage.
In a wheelbarrow?
And a wheelbarrow.
I was like, how?
Sorry. And so then I preached a sermon, 50% from the recliner, 50% from the wheelbarrow, of
When you
going
say from
like
the
a lot
wheelbarrow.
of from like I sat
You
in
sat
the wheelbarrow.
okay,
You
just
sat
want to
in the
double check.
wheelbarrow.
I sat in the wheelbarrow because you can.
You're not exactly a short man.
I know I'm not.
So was this a...
I got it from Big and Tall. So
tall
The big and
wheelbarrow.
tall wheelbarrow.
I use it as an illustration of like a lot of times we look at the Christian faith and we just want to be comfortable. And so we'll sit and we'll live our life from the sideline, sitting in a recliner, yelling and screaming at the TV, whatever it might be, but from the comfort of our own home. While the Lord's asking us to get dirty. He's asking us to go out and be the hands and feet. And sometimes we look at work as there's no rest available to us. And the beauty of a wheelbarrow is you can lean it on its handles and it is a chair. So you can work hard in the field. You can go out and hustle. But when you need a break, you can take a break.
Is that true? If you
100%.
lean it on its handles, it's a chair?
Yep. You can sit and recline back in it.
I've never sat in a...
I know what we're going to do after this podcast.
Yeah.
So-
Who's got a wheelbarrow?
So
You should preach more.
There's that, and then there's also you carrying around a 2x4 swinging at people,
Me?
talking about, their own eyeballs.
Plank in the eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I hit one of our executive pastors with it while I was preaching.
That was your sermon illustration?
It was mine.
Okay,
Yeah, I
because
used that.
my example was also from you.
Luke's. Oh, from me?
Yeah.
Oh,
Which is
okay.
the goat.
Oh, I did bring a goat on
You brought
stage.
a live goat on stage.
I did.
How'd it go?
Did it poop everywhere?
Backstage.
Yeah, there it is.
There's also a lot to that story that is real rough. We had to like stake it in the back of the church, like just on a leash.
Like,
and it was just spinning. It was like a petting zoo in the back, and children were just running and petting it until I needed to use it in the middle of a sermon. It was great.
Yeah.
So speaking of peculiar things that preachers do, do you guys, as people who are helping Sunday helping pull off a Sunday, do you have things that are it's like a pet peeve when you see a preacher do this, or something they say, something that makes you be like, I've heard people before say like, man, when a preacher does this, I'm focused on that.
out.
I check out. I can't pay
Yeah.
attention to it.
Yeah.
No.
But this is where I lead into like my production DNA.
Sure.
It's when the preacher's going, next slide.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Because it's like, we know, bro. We got you. Don't worry. Because it could be the computer's having an issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's 9 out of 10 times. It's not because we're not paying attention. But I think moments like that can cause a distraction to a service, honestly.
So let me ask you a really hard question here. What should they do?
Are you asking for a friend?
If we have preacher,
Yeah. Asking for a friend.
as someone who's never said that from the
Yeah,
stage,
right.
what would be the like better thing to do? Pretend there was never a slide
Just
in the
keep
first
going.
place?
One, I suppose there's 2 trains of thought. It's have your notes memorized or have your notes with you. And this isn't it's like we use teleprompters and they are helpful. But I think a lot of times teleprompters and screens can become a crutch.
Yeah.
And so then when that crutch falls out from underneath you, your habit is to try to catch yourself and be like, oh, next slide. And everyone else in the room doesn't realize a slide was missing. So now we've called attention to what could be a mistake, maybe wasn't. It's kind of like when a musician is playing and they mess up a note. You don't know they messed up a note until they're like,
Let's start the song over.
Yeah,
Right.
and their face turns to crumble. It's like no one else knew. And so in moments like that, we're creating an unnecessary distraction in the service. And so that's a pet peeve for me because it's
Hey, you actually didn't need to be this distracting with it. You could have just sort of subtly moved through
Yeah.
it. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Laura, what about you?
I mean,
Pet
man, I
peeve?
would say that exact same thing. Like, I did production as well for a long time. And there is something about the like break in a service of, oh, something's wrong, something's missing, or trying to get the blame off of you. You watch that happen sometimes too, which is just fun. So that I also just sometimes will check out when people are like you like very accusatory, and you're like, hey, I bet you do this too, man.
Yeah. Oh, when
you
they
could say
like
us, you could
right,
say we,
instead of using
you
like
could
the
say
corporate
our,
we or
yeah.
whatever.
They're like you. I'm like, okay, got
the
it.
public berating from the preacher.
Yeah, so you're just like, thank you so much.
I've always heard
right?
that preachers usually, if they focus in, I've heard this, I'm not saying it's true. If they zero in on a specific sin, usually it's something they're living with.
That's interesting.
Now I'm never going to zero
So
in
here's
on a
a
specific sin.
quick shortcut of all of the times Rory has existed.
I'm not saying it's
We're
true.
going to cut to every time I talked about a
Yeah,
specific
I'm not
thing.
saying it's true, but
It might be. That's interesting. I think
is an
that
interesting
for
thought.
most preachers, I think the things that they end up saying on stage often are a reflection of the things that they're actually feeling
Yeah.
or thinking about because it's
Yeah.
fresh to them.
Yep.
So I think that's both. That can both be positive.
Sure.
Where it's like, I know that I'm wrestling with this dynamic. So like, I know that I'm wrestling with whatever, making ends meet, having a great marriage,
Yep.
taking care of my kids, whatever.
Yeah.
Or even something more extreme. So I think there's a positive to that's a preacher being transparent a little bit.
Well,
or
it's
expressing
humanizing
himself.
the story.
Right.
Yes.
I think that there's also probably a way that gets dark or can, where
Yeah.
it's like the thing I'm now sort of lobbing as the greatest sin you could be committing in this
Yeah.
moment is the very thing that I'm struggling
Yeah.
with behind the
Yeah.
scenes. And I think that's a difficult thing if you
Yeah.
find a preacher doing that. You guys help produce whole services. You don't just think about the sermon.
Yeah.
What is the funniest or most awkward moment you have ever experienced in a worship service? And don't use names unless I know them.
Oh no.
Unless it's a story about
Can you
you.
go first? I got to think.
I will say anytime there's, I mean, I already talked about the goat, but there have been so many moments where there are live animals involved in a worship service. Too many, I would say. I hate when live animals are included. They poop, they scream, they cry, they smell, they run off the stage. I'm just like, let's just put an end to it.
You frequently produce
This
services
happens more than you would think. And I'm like, why does this keep happening? Now that I'm like thinking it through, yeah, I'm anti-animals.
Have you
on stage.
produced a service with a live animal in it?
No, that was all pre me. New Life used to like throw elephants in the room. It was ridiculous.
Wow.
I mean, not really elephants. I think giraffes maybe once or twice.
oh,
but
the casual giraffe.
What about you? What's the most like awkward thing you've ever experienced in a worship service?
you know, it's the Freudian slip.
Oh, sure.
You know,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
they're trying to say one thing, but something else squeezes out. It's like, or they're trying to land a joke and they think it's the funniest thing in the world, and no one else is riding with them in it.
That is always fun.
When
to
the
watch.
Freudian slip happens, I'm going to ask you another question here.
Oh boy.
What is the better thing to do? Do you acknowledge it? Or do you just keep
absolutely
going?
acknowledge it because everyone else in the room is acknowledging it.
Okay.
Enter into the space with them.
I think there's always an awkward dance that happens where it's like, I didn't mean to say this.
Sure.
So it's a little bit like the slide thing. If I call attention to it, aren't I derailing the service more than if I just keep going, put my head down,
No,
pray, get the band up there.
No,
and
because
go.
nobody
You
knew
just
the
end the
slide didn't
sermon
come
there.
up.
Yeah.
Everyone heard you just drop the
Yeah.
F-bomb. So it's like you gotta lean into it.
Well, and it's not a performance in that point, right? It's just like, hey, this is a human thing that just happened.
Yeah.
Like, let's all acknowledge that together.
Sure.
Like when a worship leader messes up, if you can acknowledge the mess up, people usually will lean in more to you than if you try to pretend like nothing ever happened.
Yes.
Sure.
Like I did that one time.
You messed up?
No,
Never.
I
No,
didn't.
I've never messed up.
I messed up on the part 2 of this. So we were doing an event and the console just died on us. And I got up and was like, hey, let's just let the spirit move in this moment as we're rebooting the system. And the worship leader, I get down, he goes, guys, the power just shut off. Let's just say what it is. Like, we're just going to sit here for a moment and wait for it to turn on. So like I was a moron in that moment. And it was like, well, shoot, I'm a punk for that. And the worship leader resurrected that moment by going, no, here's the reality of it. Let's just own it and
Call it what it
Yeah,
is.
just tell the truth.
Yeah.
yeah.
Call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
Okay, so heading into the conversation that we want to have here, thinking all things media, social media, how does preaching and all of that intersect? I want to ask like a pretty broad philosophical question about this stuff because I've heard people make these arguments. Does the church even need to be involved in this stuff? Does the church even need to be engaged in social media? There's so much stuff about how it's actually not that great for our brains. Maybe it's detrimental to us. The church being on it, is that actually like a setback? Should we even be bothering with engaging in this field?
I mean, I have like a personal opinion and then like what I think is probably actually more realistic. It's happening whether we want to engage in it or not.
Sure.
Like, so I was telling y'all before we started recording, I got off social media for a few years. Amazing. A lot happened on social media in the 3 years I wasn't on.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the world did not join me in that.
Twitter
Like,
doesn't exist anymore.
You know what that did? Down with X. Up with Threads? I don't know. That's what I mean. Like suddenly Twitter's gone and Threads is here. I'm like, cool. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
However, that all happened whether or not I was engaged with it or not. So, I think at the end of the day, to be like, we're completely hands off of social media, probably not the most practical.
Sure.
And I think, you hear from teenagers and from parents, like, well, if they're not hearing stuff from you, they're going to hear it from someone.
Sure.
So yeah, if the church is off social media, fine, but people are still going to be in that space and either they hear great news from you or they hear news from someone else.
Yeah, Aaron, how do you think about that?
No, it's the reality. I mean, everyone's on it. I mean, data shows it. Not everyone, obviously, but a majority of people are. And yes, social media is not great for the psyche. It's not great for personal well-being or emotional mental health. No doubt about it. But it's not because of the platform. It's because of the content. And so, like, for me, my desire is our church content, things like that. I want our content to oppose the other content that might be coming in. It's like, why would I just let poison exist when I can come up with an antidote for it?
Yeah.
And so that's my perspective on it. It's like, it's a necessary evil, so to speak. And so I want to enter into it with an intentionality that draws people into something better, not letting them continue to go down a spiral into something worse.
Yeah.
Sure. So, Aaron, we said at the top of this episode, you've done some real like focused content around this. I think for a lot of preachers and pastors, we even heard this at Essential Church. The idea of even beginning to engage with it in more than a like social media is our online bulletin board, basically, feels like so overwhelming. Yeah. And I think for a lot of them, so unrealistic, right? There are plenty of people who are, to be an influencer on social media, you're posting like all the time. You're actively, it's like your job. You're focused in on it. You help really slim some stuff down, though, talking about two sort of key questions you can ask to help get your brain and your, not just you as a pastor or preacher, but your whole church thinking about how to engage with it. Can you talk through some of those for us?
Well, if as a communicator, as an organization, if you're just making a social media account and pumping out content, and there's not a strategy behind it, you're just making a bunch of noise. There's no impact behind it. And so if you can go into asking two real simple questions and having the answers to those questions, then that helps form where you're heading with it. It's not determining your destination. It's giving you the direction to get to that destination.
Sure, that's good.
The data does all that kind of stuff. And so the first simple question, which is extremely basic, is do you know who you're trying to reach? Like, who are you trying to communicate to? I think as Christians, as believers, we take to heart, be fishers of men, cast our net out, try to catch as many people as we can. That's just not realistic these days. Your community, your church is located in a specific community that's going to be different than perhaps another one. And so for us to take here at New Life Church, our North congregation, which is can tend to be a little bit more upper middle class, affluent, white primarily, and go, we now need to make us look like perhaps a congregation that's further downtown that may have a different socioeconomic status. It's inauthentic to who we are. We're not actually making an impact for the local community that we're in. And so you got to know who you're trying to communicate, and then you just got to understand how you're going to reach them. You know, the average person is checking their email 77 times a day. They're spending 2.5 hours a day on social media. They are picking up their phone 215 times a day. Like, that's all just averages. So what I was trying to share at Essential Church was the preacher is getting 35 to 45 minutes with these people. The communication people are getting 2.5 hours per day with these people. And we have to be mindful of that. And so our content, it needs to be consistent. It needs to be going out there, but it needs to be intentional. It can't just be plastering and throwing and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, carrying along that line, Aaron, you're talking about the time differentiation of, like, you as a pastor are talking for 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 40, however long. These people that are looking at their phones all day long. Do you think that I think that pastors and preachers constantly feel the pressure to be the primary communicator for anything and everything that is going on 100%. In the church. Laura, I'll direct this to you. Do you think that, like, using media, using a communications department, using social media well, I would be under the impression that actually takes the pressure off of their shoulders. They don't have to say every announcement from stage. They don't have to be the primary voice for everything that is going on. They actually that can be released a little bit.
Yeah, well, and I think what's interesting when you talk about, like, who's being reached through social media, I would say there's a difference between who's on Facebook or Instagram.
100%.
Like, who you're reaching through your Facebook content is most likely someone who's liked your page, is following your pastor. So yeah, they're going to get your inside content. It's like, hey, we have an event. We have this coming up.
Sure.
These announcements belong here. But on Instagram, you could be reaching who knows, especially through Reels now, the way that they function. Like, you're going to reach people who aren't necessarily following your church. So your insider event information might not actually belong there.
It's not helpful.
It's not as helpful as you think it is. But I think we for so long have taken the same just blank statement. All social media gets this content and it looks like our emails and it's kind of functioning the same. It's not actually as helpful as we think it is.
No, it's not. And that's why you got to understand each platform and the demographic.
Yeah.
So for us, our Instagram leans more towards the 35 to 44-year-old women. Facebook is going to be your 55 to 65 across the board. YouTube is the 44 to 55-year-old male.
Oh, interesting.
So we can't do the same content for everything. And so, like, what I've told people, even at the Essential Church that you brought up, I said, do not just copy and paste across the board. It's not going to work. It's easy.
Yeah.
It's how you feel like you're making the greatest impact, but it's not doing anything. Because, like, with Instagram, for instance, it'll release, when you do a post, like a feed post, not necessarily a reel or a story, when you post it, it's only going out to 12% of your followers. And you have to have 10% of that 12% to engage with. And that doesn't mean like, it means like comment or share or save before it releases to the rest of the followers.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like we think that the more content we pump out is going to drive engagement and help us reach more people, when the reality is you're actually hurting yourself by not using the right content.
Yeah, I think what this conversation sounds like to me is a really similar conversation to what missionaries have when they get ready to go on a mission field. Is they're having conversations about who is engaging with what, why, and how. It's demographic questions. It's trying to figure out how do we take the good news, like how do we take the gospel, and how do we contextualize it for a certain group of people in a certain place at a certain time?
100%.
I think that's what's really interesting. Because I think for so many people I talk to, especially in the ministry world, using their ministries and social media in conjunction with one another feels like such a foreign concept. But I think what it's really asking some of us to do is just, we've got to do the work of contextualizing our ministries towards like the spaces that we find them. I think Sunday has become the place where we can be pretty like wide in general.
Yeah. Anything
can happen and it can work.
Yeah.
But these social media platforms are calling for like really specific things that only work in certain places. So speaking of that, are there pastors, preachers, accounts that you guys are going like, these people seem to be getting this right?
Yeah.
Are there accounts that come to your mind?
There's one that comes to my mind. I don't know about you, Lord, after being off for 3 years.
I know. I was like, let me recap. Who do I still follow?
Actually, a pastor in San Antonio, Texas, Community Bible Church, his name is Ed Newton.
Yeah.
He has access to his account, but his creative team also curates content.
Sure.
But he does a phenomenal job. There's a humanity and authenticity to the account, but there's also a certain level of excellence that's being experienced. He's a young guy, he's mid-40s. I mean, he wears flat bill caps and he's wearing Nikes and Jordans, and he's a cool guy, but his content is relevant and it's meaningful. Like it draws you in, because usually when he's putting something out, there's an inspirational side of it. It's not a bulletin board. And that's where he excels really well. So does their church excels really well.
Yeah. So Laura, to give you a bit of a spin on this question, because you are coming into this going like, I've chosen to be off of social media for 3 years. Aaron talked about, authenticity, this sort of like, there's a genuine spirit to what someone is doing with an account.
Yeah.
What are the things that you would say to a pastor, a teacher, a leader who's going like, I want to help you, I want to start utilizing social media to expand the reach of the ministry that we're already doing? What are the like things that you would hope to see them carry into that space? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like this should be a no-brainer kind of answer, but have we engaged the Holy Spirit in what we're doing? It feels like, since social media is so cultural, that you almost don't have to treat it as ministry in a sense. You can kind of just be like, well, let me post this quote or this verse or whatever, and just kind of like, this will be good content. But is this something that's coming from the Holy Spirit? Is this something that you feel is pressing that you need to share because this is part of your ministry that you're doing? As you would prayerfully consider your sermon on a Sunday morning, you would prayerfully consider every post before you post it.
Oh, that's good.
And also, I think checking the reason behind each post. Social media is the slipperiest slope of pride versus actual ministry. Because, man, I mean, and how are we all not guilty of this? It was a big reason why I got off, was like, I could not disassociate between likes and if this is actually just a nice thing to post that's actually helpful for people. The line was completely blurred. And I was like, I'm getting my value off of this. If I don't get enough likes, then this is not working. And man, it's hard to walk that line.
No, that's so good, because even as you're talking about it, if the way you think about it is it's like a mission field, it is a way to contextualize the gospel, then it can't just be we're throwing things onto it and seeing what sticks. It has to have some, not just thought, like not strategy, but it also has to have some spirit behind it.
Now, yes, I don't think everything does, right? There's going to be those flipping posts where you're going to throw out, man, what a great hike this was. And I think stuff like that is totally fine, right?
Absolutely.
But you got to be mindful of who did you get in an argument with on social media that now you might have to get up and preach in front of. And so there has to be a level-headedness and a humility to your interaction on all digital platforms. I mean, as creative teams, we're paid to create the micro sermon. We're paid to edit down, to put something out there that is, one, going to make the pastor look good, right? We're not going to put out a really crappy quote. We're going to do something really great.
So
Pastor Brady is cranking on all cylinders when he's on social media, 60 seconds,
right?
Because we want to influence the end user to follow through and click through to watch the whole sermon. So there's an intentionality, there's a strategy behind it. So even as the pastor posting, you got to think of your audience, because you're not just a preacher to Republicans. You're not just a preacher to Democrats. You're not just a preacher to white people or black people or brown people. You are a pastor to all people. And so you got to be really careful with how you navigate the digital platforms.
Can you talk about this? There are 4 categories, or at least 4 ways that you think about people as you use social media. And I don't know that you came up with this, but it's a helpful framework. And talk a little bit about those categories and how you're trying to move them through.
Yeah. So
media.
4 categories that I see. So the first category, if you look at it, is in the circles that kind of set in within each other, like the Swedish dolls, how one pops into another. The outside one is the community. These are the people who are around your church or your organization. They are in the orbit of your building. They are not yet attending. They haven't checked it out. So they're just existing in the solar system of your organization. Then you have your crowd, which is your next step. And those are the people who are visiting, they're attending. They're not yet committed. They're probably not givers. They're not a part of anything midweek.
They're part of the mob.
They're part of the mob. That's exactly right. And then you go from the crowd to then the committed or your congregation. These are the people who are giving. They're part of bringing their kids to youth group on Wednesday nights. They're part of a men's group or a small group, something like that. Then after that, you have your core. The core are your walking billboards. They're the ones that have the stickers on their back windshield.
Sure.
They're the ones who are wearing your church merch, all that kind of stuff. They're the ones who are all in on you. And so for us in New Life, it's going, okay, well, how do we navigate those 4 people? Like I'm viewing our social media, I'm viewing our live streams through this lens of, okay, who are we going after? So like we'll use our social advertising. We're not spending our money on our core or even the committed. We're spending our social advertising dollars on the community going, here's what's, we want to invite you. Here's the life of inside the church to try to get them into the crowd. And then we use the in-room experience, the stage platform, announcements, Pastor Brady's emails, things like that, to get them from the crowd to the committed. I really am not worried about the core because they're already in. They're already here. They are tithing. They're givers. They're supporting the ministry. So great. Kudos to you guys. But from a communication standpoint, I'm not thinking about you.
I think that's so helpful because what it helps us do is recognize that in every space we find ourselves, we're talking to people who are with us at different points in their journey.
Yep.
And not just their faith journey. Like I think that's even like a separate conversation, but just their journeys of engaging with your church and how you're then using media, I think impacts all those in completely different ways. Let's move a little bit. You guys spend time in the world of media, but Laura, I know you specifically spend a ton of time in the world of like creative direction and how like a church, the like weekend experience is unfolding before us. I want to ask a question on behalf of like the preachers that are watching or the lead pastors or whatever. What is like the healthiest like conjunction or intersection between creative direction and their preaching or their sermons? What is the way that those work together well? How do they work together well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it totally depends on who your pastor is too. Because some pastors are so uber creative and have so much vision for like, this is what I'm seeing. And I've got this really cool prop or illustration. You're like, that's awesome. Let's work that in with the whole service. And then others are like, I'm just going to preach my message. And like, I would love for you to handle that. And like, I'll tell you if I don't like it, but otherwise we're good. And so in our context, we've kind of got a combo of both people who are preaching. And so it just almost depends on the campus that you're at. Because our church is all live teaching. And so kind of what it looks like for us is just meeting regularly and hearing from them overall, what is like the feeling you hope people are getting from this series? What's the tone of this series? Some are light, some are not. Some are really, really heavy. And it's like, okay, well then we probably need to know throughout the whole service, like worship's heading to this moment where we're going to talk about like we just were in a series on money, sex, and power. Like, okay, that's a heavy subject matter. So what is the look of this series going to be? Like, well, it probably needs to feel like light and easy and not like dark. And we don't want it to feel like oppressive. And those are funny words to use. But when you think about graphics, you can kind of know if you see one, you're like, oh, okay. That's a little intimidating to look at. And so that's how we would kind of navigate that through.
Aaron, is that similar for you here at New Life? Are you guys, is it a collaborative process? How does that unfold?
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely collaborative. I'll work with our designers and our film team, but then our senior leadership team, whether it be Pastor Brady or John Egan or something like that, to go, okay, what's the next series? And what are we feeling like this is going to play out to be? Because we have to realize that everything that someone sees is saying something to them. So every image, every banner, every graphic is speaking something intentionally or unintentionally. And we have to be mindful of that and cognizant of that. So like we have a series coming up that's going to be on gender identity and sex and marriage. And it's like, it's asking the big questions of what does scripture say about these three separate things? That's a heavy thing to talk about, especially today.
So can I ask, how do we think about the tone of that? Are you guys going like, well, it's a serious topic, so we need to counterbalance it and make the like presentation of it feel light and chipper and it's gonna be great? Or are you like, no, this is like, we got to be super uber serious? Or what are you trying to find a balance? How does that work?
I think it's finding a balance because we don't want to be manipulative in what we're creating. We want to be truthful in our designs, just like Pastor Brady is truthful when he's preaching the message.
Sure.
So we need to make sure that what we're creating is matching the intensity and tone of how he's delivering.
Yes.
The nice thing is Pastor Brady is very level. Like Pastor Brady doesn't change. He's not an intense guy and then a super mellow or sad kind of guy. So it's very easy to understand, okay, this is where he's going. And it's just going, okay, well, what do the colors look like then? What's the font type? You know, is there any background imagery that we need to be mindful of? And so there is a dance to it, and we don't always get it right the first time, which is why we go through rounds of creative and trying to figure it out. And we present it and go, what do you think? And no, we're not really liking that. And here's the why we don't. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Let me ask you guys, I want you both to answer this. For like the lead pastor or even the executive pastor who's listening to this, who feels the tension of like, I've got this sermon series or I've got this thing I want to do, but I've got to relay the idea to my creative team and help them like figure out what I'm actually doing. But you have those moments where you like you butt because you're both trying to solve the same problem.
Yeah.
What is the thing that you guys would like? What could you say to lead pastors and be like, here's what's going through the mind of your creative people when those things are happening? When you bring like this big flaming idea and are like, let's burn it on the altar. And then you guys get to work on it. What's the thing that you wish that they could know about their creative people?
That's
a lot. Like, I think, first I would say for creative people, like try not to say no if you don't have to.
Yep.
The obligatory no is just, it's not helping anyone. So lead pastors, if you've got a creative person who's not saying no for nothing,
it's a great
then
start.
let's get there.
Yeah.
And then if a no comes, can we accept that and start to have a different solution? But I think for me, like if I'm saying no, it means because we literally can't fly you in from the ceiling because someone will get hurt. You know what I mean? Like that's why we're saying no. It's not because I don't like your idea. It's not because I don't like your vision. However,
it's because our insurance company will not let us.
It's all about insurance. At the end of the day.
Why does everyone always want to fly in from the balcony?
Flaming swords and flying from balconies.
So, but it's like, hey, I love that vision. Here are 3 other things that I could do that will accomplish the same vision.
Yeah.
So hopefully, lead pastors, you've got someone doing that. And if you don't, what can you do to cultivate that kind of culture?
Yeah, develop that person.
Yeah, where you're like, this is how we respond to feedback.
That's good.
And respond to vision.
Aaron,
like
what
that.
would you say to that?
Yeah, I think there are 2 different avenues, right? It is the creative approach, but also the pastoral approach. So for the creative, yes, don't say no, but you need to be able to ask good questions to try to understand what the pastor's trying to communicate. Because like they'll go, there's been times where we'll send out a design like, it's just not bright enough. What do you mean?
Yeah.
Is it the color? Is it the saturation? Is it just the image? So for a pastor, they need to be able to articulate what they're looking for and don't get mad if questions are being asked. Because we're not asking questions because we don't believe in your idea. We're asking questions because we want to execute your idea with excellence.
Yes.
And so there's a defensiveness, I think, that some pastors can take. Like I've experienced it where lead pastors are like, I know what I'm talking about. And so just do what I want you to do. Okay, but you don't even know what you want to do. And so I want to help that for you. So let me ask you questions. So there needs to be a humility in dealing with creatives. And it's also knowing that creatives care.
Yeah.
Like the gifts that we have from capturing and editing film to capturing photography to graphic design to audio visual lighting in live production, the Lord has given specific individuals that gift. And you have chosen to invest financially in that gift. So we need to trust that gift.
Yes.
Doesn't mean that gift is going to be right 100% of the time, but let's enter into the wrestle together to discover what is the right approach for whatever we're coming up with.
That's so good. I love what you both said. So like lead pastors, preachers, like your creative people, man, they care. Like they want to help you execute like the everything but flying in off of the balcony.
Yeah.
And man, if we could, we would.
I don't know if I would, honestly. I still don't know.
We would. Laura, this question specifically for you. One of the things that Compass does brilliantly is you tell great stories about what God is doing in the life of the people in your church. Which is not just like this standalone, we produce stories and they sit over here. One of the things Drew does so brilliantly is he often will work those into how he's teaching and not just telling it, but actually showing like this beautifully put together story. Can you talk for a minute about like the philosophy behind not just telling the stories, but even how you guys are executing those?
Yeah. I mean, the philosophy behind it, for me, comes from Revelation. It says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So basically, like a person's testimony is inviting the spirit of prophecy to say what he did for me, he could do for you. So if someone's sharing their story of a redeemed marriage, of financial recovery, of mourning a lost child, but coming back to the Lord, like whatever the story is, what he's done for me, he can do for you. And it's just inviting this space to say, Holy Spirit can move.
It's good.
And so people know they're not alone too, in a really simple way. So that's kind of the philosophy behind the why. And then how it happens, it depends. Sometimes there's a series where like we know, like we just did a marriage series. Well, Drew's like, I've preached on marriage for 20 something years. I'd love to not tell another one of my stories. Do we have someone else who we could share? So like, yeah, we heard this great story from a marriage class, a really beautiful story of a couple. And so reached out, got their story. Great. Like worked it into the sermon, as you said.
How do you guys source those? Is it just like in a staff meeting, someone's like, hey, great thing that I heard this weekend?
Sometimes. I mean, it really depends. So sometimes we host a newcomers gathering frequently, probably about once a month, where Drew and Michelle invite people into their home. And these are people who are just starting to get engaged in Compass. And they go around and kind of tell their story. And I'm usually writing down like, oh, that was a really cool moment. Or like, I bet they've got something interesting there. To follow up and be like, cool, we could pocket that for a time where it comes up, or maybe we just need to record it and hold it and it will present itself. We've done that before too, where it sits for 2 years and then you're like, oh my gosh, this is the series where we're going to bring that story out.
Bring the story out.
Yeah. And you're kind of like coaching the people too, like, by the way, this is happening.
Yeah.
So that's one way. Sometimes if it's like, hey, we need a marriage story, go to the marriage pastor and be like, who do you know that's got a great story? And he's like, oh, this couple just went through this. They're awesome. Like, I think they'd be willing to share their story. And that's the hard part. Some people just don't want to share their story.
Yeah.
And so forcing it, which unfortunately I've done, where you're sitting with someone, you're like, this is not going well because they do not want to be here.
They want to
But
die.
they felt a little coerced into telling their story. And so you're like, okay, well, let's not do that again. So there is a fine balance of knowing like, this is a story that they want to tell, that's worth telling. We all feel comfortable with it. And this is going to really help people experience their testimony.
That's so good. I love that you guys do that. It's one of the best things that Drew does at Compass. It's one of the best things that Compass does. The way that we end these episodes is we always ask our guests.
I know.
Do you want to keep talking? Do you have some more stuff you want to talk about?
This has been a fantastic conversation, Lauren.
We'll keep
Rocky
talking
start,
off the camera.
solid in the middle.
Rocky start.
Solid.
We
in the
covered
middle.
about 30 minutes in. We're cranking.
One of the things that we ask people who come on here as guests is, we have the privilege of doing this and talking to people who are getting ready, probably right now as we talk, to preach in a few days. So they're going to go stand up for 30 minutes and give it all that they got. What is a pastoral word of encouragement, challenge, whatever it might be, that you would love to share with these folks?
I think for me it would be to stop performing. The adults in the room can tell.
Yes.
So just be you.
Ouch. Okay.
As awkward as you might be, as awkward as you
Why'd
might
you stare
be,
at me when you said it?
because you are the preacher in the room
As
right
awkward
now.
as they might
Awkward
be.
as they might be.
I think so many pastors feel like they have to present themselves in a I got my life together and I know what I'm talking about. The Lord speaks through me. And it's like, man, you have had stomach cramps just like I have. Like just be yourself, and speak authentically to who you are. Because the rest of us want to enter into that same humanity with you. So stop the performing, stop trying to come up with the latest, greatest.
Yes.
The scriptures don't need your creativity. They just need you to deliver it.
Good word. Stop performing. Laura, what about you?
Yeah, I would say start reframing how you approach creativity. You just said it, like, for the next best thing, or to compete with XYZ church.
What some pastor in a 60-second clip did.
Yes, where we know you're seeing a highlight, not the full story of what's happening. But I just think there's a 3-word phrase that, like, has been with me all year, which is just creator-inspired creativity. Simple as that should be, how often do I go off that and start doing it for my own pride, or to prove something, or to compete, or to just be creative for the sake of checking the creative box? But inviting God into that process with you, like, he is the most creative being. So what does he have to say about this? And what does he want from you when it comes to creativity?
Wow, so good. Guys, thank you. And this conversation certainly does not even come close to, like, scraping the bottom of the barrel on media and creative direction and how it all flows together in the church. So hopefully for those of you that are watching and listening, this is just like a
part 2.
This part 2. Yeah, okay. We'll see. Take us 40
We're
minutes.
We're going to rally and then come back.
No, but hopefully this is just like enough of a taster, or enough for you to, like, start asking some really good questions about how you're doing things, or about the things that you're not yet doing that you need to start doing. So thank you guys both for joining us. Thank you. You work here. Your office is upstairs. You drove all the way from Texas to be here today. So thank you for being here with us, guys. Thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you next time.